This is the third lecture on Chapter F. And in this lecture, I'm going to start talking about using two melodies with each other to create counterpoint. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is these four terms written on the board behind me: oblique, contrary, similar, and parallel. These terms describe the two types of motion that you can have when you combine one melody with another melody. In other words, it describes the relative motion of the two lines. Okay, here's an example of oblique motion. Oblique motion occurs when one melody doesn't move and the other melody does move. So you've got the soprano line going do, do, and you've got the bass line going do, mi. So one stays the same and the other moves, and that's oblique motion. It's typical when we have counterpoint and we're trying to write correct counterpoint to kind of keep track of the relationship of the melodies by writing the harmonic interval of each harmonic dyad. A harmonic dyad is a harmonic interval. It's two notes that are played together. The dyad means two notes, and harmonic means that they occur simultaneously. Even though these notes are 2 octaves apart, I'm going to write an 8 to show that in the simplest terms, they're an octave apart. They're actually a compound octave, but that's okay, 8 will do. And these notes are an octave plus a 6th apart, but I'm just going to write the number 6. For the time being, we will be only using consonant intervals. So the intervals that we will have between our notes will be thirds, fifths, and that would be perfect fifths, sixths, and octaves. And because we're talking about a soprano voice and a bass voice, those voices are not ever going to be in unison. The closest they'll be to each other will be a perfect fifth. So in fact, when we say that the notes are a third apart, what we're really going to mean is that they're a 10th apart, but we represent the compound interval as if it's a simple interval. Let me show a little bit more of oblique motion. Now I'll keep the bass the same and I'll move the soprano. And now again, I'll keep the soprano the same and I'll move the bass. So this shows you some oblique motion between the two voices. Like so. Contrary motion means that the two voices are moving in the opposite direction. So for instance, the two voices could start out close to one another, and then one could go up and the other could go down. And then again, one could go up and the other could go down. Or one could go down and the other could go up. So that's an example of contrary motion. One moves up, the other moves down. Or one moves down, the other moves up. And here's what this sounds like. Similar motion occurs when the voices move in the same direction, but not by the same interval. So for instance, this is an example of similar motion. I start out on an octave, both voices move up, but they move up by different intervals, so they have a different interval between them. Then here they both move down, but again they move down by different intervals. And again they move down, but they move down by different intervals. So you don't have 2 of the same interval in a row. You have a different interval, even though the direction of motion is the same. The reason I explain similar motion like this is to distinguish it from parallel motion. In parallel motion, the lines move by the same interval, at least the same size of interval. So we maintain the same distance between the notes. The F and the A are a 6th apart. They both move by second. Doesn't matter whether it's a major or a minor second. So they get to another harmonic dyad that's a 6th. Then they both move by a 4th, so they're still a 6th apart. And then here, the C moves down by half step, the E moved down by whole step, but the interval size between the notes is still the same, and that's parallel motion. What we will see is that all four of these are good ways of moving the lines in relation to each other. With oblique motion and contrary motion, there are fewer opportunities to make mistakes. In similar motion and parallel motion, there are more restrictions. And what I'll talk about next are some of the restrictions that you need to observe when you write using similar and parallel motion. Okay, the place in your counterpoint writing where you have to be the most careful is in approaching perfect intervals, in approaching the perfect octave, the perfect fifth, the perfect 12th, the perfect 15th, any of those perfect intervals. We're not going to be counting the perfect fourth as a consonance, so hopefully you won't have any perfect fourths as harmonic dyads. What I'm going to present to you as a series of rules is just a way of teaching you what was the practice in classical music or music of the common practice era. So I'm talking about what composers felt was correct to do in the 17th and 18th century, maybe the 19th century. There's nothing, I'm not making a value judgment about these sounds. In the 20th and the 21st century, all these sounds were used very often, and often in a way that was quite beautiful. But we're going to kind of put ourselves in the mindset of classical composers. Yes, that means mostly dead European white men. And we're going to try to understand what made them tick and what sorts of ideas informed the music that they were writing. So you'll have to sort of bear with me and be a little bit imaginative in imagining these composers and musicians from another era. Okay, so first thing that you cannot do is you cannot move from an octave to another octave. Okay, so if you find yourself doing this and you have 2 8s in a row, that is not a good thing. That constitutes a mistake in counterpoint. And the reason it does is that when you have 2 lines moving in the same direction by the same interval and they're an octave apart, it's as if you have a little bit of monophony breaking up your polyphony. These lines kind of blend into each other. So it sounds like they've morphed or combined together into one line instead of being 2 independent lines. The same thing is true, though maybe not to quite the same extent, of parallel perfect fifths. They also cause the line to lose its sense of independence from the other line. So you should not have 2 5s in a row. Okay, so I'm going to write in big black letters underneath here, wrong. Again, it's not morally wrong, it's just wrong if you're trying to imitate the music of classical composers. Now, it turns out that even if you move by contrary motion from a fifth to another fifth, or from an octave to another octave, that is still wrong. So you shouldn't have 2 8s in a row or 2 5s in a row, whether they're moving in parallel motion or whether the voices are moving in contrary motion. Just always be on the lookout for that. Okay, here's another thing that you should not do. You should not approach a perfect interval by similar motion if there is a leap in the soprano part, and a leap would be anything bigger than a step. Okay, so here we're going from the harmonic dyad of a third or a tenth, and both voices are going down, so we approach the fifth in similar motion with a leap, and that's what's called a direct perfect fifth, and it's not quite as bad as a set of parallel perfect fifths, but it's still wrong. And here we have a leap in the soprano part. It doesn't matter that the bass is moving by step, we're still moving into that octave by similar motion with a leap in the soprano, and that is wrong. But if you move from a harmonic dyad to an octave or a fifth in similar motion with a step in the soprano, that's good. Okay, so this is okay, and that's not a direct fifth or a direct octave. Now that we've learned some vocabulary to describe the different kinds of motion that 2 lines can have relative to each other, and we've learned some of the types of motion that are forbidden, we'll talk a little bit in a little bit more detail in the next lecture about the guidelines for putting two lines together and having counterpoint between them.